Ladies and gentlemen, if we could come to what passes for order in the land of Israel, I'd like to welcome you all to one of the signature events in the annual cycle of Hartman Institute activities, the annual Kogod lecture. It's named for Bob Kogod, who is, in addition to being a businessman and philanthropist in my neck of the woods in D.C., is a true visionary in the area of activities that support and uplift the Jewish people. The building that you are in tonight would not exist were it not for his vision and involvement, as well as his generosity. It's a physical testament to his spiritual commitment. He has, in years past, chaired the Hartman Institute board. He remains active on the board in the affairs of the Institute, and we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to him. This is also a signature event in the annual cycle of the Hartman Institute Philosophers Conference. We are now convened for our 28th time. It began as a gleam in David Hartman's eye. It's taken on a life of its own. My name is Bill Galston, along with my wife Miriam. I serve as the American co-organizer of the annual philosophy conference, and it's a labor of love, and it is a particularly pleasurable piece of this labor of love that I get to meet wonderful people on, and even on occasion to introduce them to the rest of you. And that is my privilege, and I mean it, tonight with Yossi Klein Halevi. Some basics. Some of you know him, some of you don't. He was born in Borough Park, Brooklyn. His father was a Holocaust survivor, which is not an insignificant piece of biography. And I have read that he made Aliyah in 1982. Please correct me if that's not correct. And since then, he has had a very distinguished career as a journalist and now an author of 3 books. I will touch on 2 of them very briefly in these remarks. As a youth, not even a young adult, but a beginning teenager, he joined the Beitar movement and ended up, in fairly short order, as a follower of the Rabbi Meir Kahane. And he describes his process of enthrallment followed by disenchantment with the Kahane movement in his first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. And this is one of several reasons why I asked for the honor of introducing you, because we have this in common. I was attracted to Beitar at the age of 13, and I was attracted by the astonishing prose and vision of Vladimir Jabotinsky, right? And he struck me as a prophet, but not a dreamer. And I found that combination extremely attractive, as you did. And the question you pose in your latest book, Like Dreamers, is what happens when utopian movements become central to a nation's political life? This book, Like Dreamers, is in effect parallel lives. The lives of 7 young men born in Israel, all of them, I believe, just about all of them, who come together in a single paratrooper brigade to liberate the Western Wall. And then what happens to them in the next 30 years or so? And the entire story of the state of Israel is told through the prism of these 7 characters. Speaking as an American Jew, it is the single best explanation of what has happened in the state of Israel, an explanation that really makes clear not only the ideological cross-currents, but the human dynamics of the conflicts that we read about with only partial comprehension in the daily newspapers. If you read only one book about Israel in the next year or so, in my judgment, despite other books that are being touted, this is the one you ought to read. And Yossi is going to talk to us this evening on the topic, after the success and failure of Zionism, you're already provoked even before the semicolon, the future of diaspora-Israel relations. Yossi, our pleasure.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. And it seems that we have a lot to talk about after this is over. And good evening, everyone. I'm delighted and honored to be here with you. In August 1950, Jacob Blaustein, who was the head of the American Jewish Committee, flew to Israel on what he regarded as an emergency mission of clarification. Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the UN, had just made a speech calling on young American Jews to move en masse to the state of Israel and help build up the new state. And for Jacob Blaustein, this was in effect a declaration of war against his identity as an American Jew. And the specter of dual loyalty, which was very much alive for American Jews in those years, became for Blaustein a clear and an immediate threat. And so he flew to Israel for a meeting with Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to get a confirmation from Ben-Gurion that this is not official Israeli policy, that the Israeli government recognizes that it does not in fact have a political claim on the loyalty of diaspora Jews. Ben-Gurion delivered that assurance at a festive dinner in Jerusalem, and their exchange became known as the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion exchange, which in effect defined the nature of diaspora-Israel relations, certainly of American Jewish-Israeli relations, for the better part of 2 generations. And the implicit agreement that emerged from the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion exchange was that Israel would make a clear distinction in its claim on the loyalty of Jews living outside its borders between Jews who lived in democracies and Jews who lived in dictatorships. So Soviet Jews, for example, the state of Israel insisted that it did have a claim on their welfare, on their loyalty, and acted upon it. By contrast, Ben-Gurion relinquished any claim on the loyalty of American Jews, or by extension, Jews living anywhere in democratic countries. And one can add parenthetically that Pollard was a clear violation of Blaustein-Ben-Gurion, and as far as we can determine, a rare violation. For the most part, the state of Israel kept to the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein agreement, to the spirit of the accord. At least that's how I would interpret it. And in exchange for acknowledging that it does not have a claim on the political loyalties of American Jews, Blaustein committed certainly his organization, and by extension the American Jewish community, to be actively involved in economic assistance to the state and championing its political interests as well. That model, in which neither side expressed the slightest interest in the nature of the Jewish life that was being created by both communities. This was a purely utilitarian arrangement. That arrangement has now reached its inevitable crisis point, and the relationship between the diaspora and large parts of the diaspora and the State of Israel is increasingly dysfunctional. And I should add parenthetically that when I admit readily to this, when I speak about the diaspora, I am referring primarily to North American Jewry. The reason for that is several-fold. One is because that's the diaspora that I know. And secondly, because I think, like many Israelis, I've become increasingly pessimistic about the chances of certain diasporas, and I'm thinking specifically about large parts of Europe, to thrive in the long term. So my apologies to the rest of the diaspora. I know that I am being, in some sense, I'm offering a very narrow perspective. Nevertheless, I am speaking about primarily North American Jewry and its relationship to Israel. Now, the growing dysfunctional nature of this relationship is due both to the success of Zionism and to the failure of Zionism. Zionism made a number of promises to the Jewish people. The first promise was that it would create a state, it would ingather those among the Jews who wanted to come home, and it would create the means for Jews to be able to defend themselves. These promises Zionism kept, and in that sense, Zionism has been an unequivocal success in that sense. The promise of Zionism to end the exile of the Jewish people was fulfilled in 1989, not in 1948, but I would argue in 1989, when the Iron Curtain fell. And if we define exile as the condition of enforced separation from homeland, then by 1989, there were no longer any really significant Jewish communities that were living in that condition. And so with the fall of the Iron Curtain, the exile ended, and we are now in the state of diaspora, which is a voluntary condition. Now, it is hard for many Jews to make that transition from the condition of exile to diaspora, especially my generation growing up in the United States, defined by the Soviet Jewry movement, the struggle against exile. And that just how difficult it is for some Jews to let go was reinforced for me recently. There was a headline in one of the Israeli English language websites, news websites, and a banner headline, emergency airlift of 19 Kiev Jews to Israel. Now, I had to look at that headline a few times. First of all, there is no need for an emergency airlift of Jews anywhere to the State of Israel, including from Kiev, because there are at least 2 flights daily from Kiev to the State of Israel. Secondly, if they found 19 Jews who were in a state of emotional crisis, which is understandable given what is going on in Ukraine, but to turn that into stage 2 of the Soviet Jewry movement really seemed to me an indication of just how hard it is, as Abba Eban once said, to take yes for an answer. And the yes that we need to take for an answer is the exile is over. We won. Zionism won. The next promise that Zionism made to the Jewish people was that it would restore us as a nation among nations. It would create a place of dignity and respect for the Jewish state. And here we all know that this promise has been met at best partially. This promise has known better days and worse days, A low point was 1975 with the Zionism racism resolution. A high point came in 1991 with the repeal of the Zionism racism resolution, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and not coincidentally, the establishment of diplomatic relations with dozens of countries around the world with whom Israel had either had severed relations since 67 and especially 73, or had never had relations at all, India, China, the Vatican. So a high point in Israel's acceptance among the community of nations was the early 90s. The Oslo process was I believe, a response to that, and I would add, just as an aside, that the Israeli public feels most comfortable with Israeli peace initiatives when our status internationally, diplomatically, seems more secure, and when our status is much less secure, we tend to turn towards the isolationist right. And so we reach the point today where we seem to be heading toward an historic low point in our relations with the international community and our ability to maintain a place of dignity as a sovereign state in the community of nations. And the final promise that Zionism made to the Jewish people, or certain figures within the Zionist movement, was to end anti-Semitism, and here, of course, Zionism has been a complete and utter failure, to such an extent that Zionism itself is today the pretext for the renewal of much of global anti-Semitism. It should be said really in praise of the early Zionists, that they had a tremendous courage. They had the courage to spurn a kind of Jewish self-pity and examine the Jewish condition with a certain relentless self-criticism, and looking at the Jewish condition and saying, why is there anti-Semitism? And really rejecting the notion of the whole world is against us, and there is something inherent in Esau's hatred for Jacob, and to really try to understand in rational ways why anti-Semitism persists in virtually every culture. And by the way, just today on the news, I don't know how many of you saw this, but the chief rabbi of Krakow, apparently there is such an institution, and he made a statement the other day that all Gentiles hate Jews. And this has not gone over well with some of his communal leaders, some of the communal leaders in Poland. He claims he didn't make the statement. They have now found the transcript. Nevertheless, this is this notion of an inherent, almost genetic Gentile hatred for the Jewish people runs deep in Jewish thinking. And the early Zionists rejected this notion and were looking really for a rational understanding for why anti-Semitism persists. The Zionist theoretician, really a forerunner of Zionism, who, to my mind, was the most moving and I'd say far-reaching in his attempt to understand the meaning and persistence of anti-Semitism, was Dr. Leon Pinsker. Late 19th century Russia, began as an assimilationist, an active member of an organization promoting the acculturation of Russian Jews into Russian society. The pogroms of 1881 were a profound shock to him, not the fact so much that the pogroms happened, but that socialist leaders remained largely silent in the face of the pogroms. And he became a proto-Zionist, a forerunner of Zionism. And his famous pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation, was an attempt to diagnose. He was a medical doctor, and he was attempting to diagnose anti-Semitism, which he treated as a kind of illness. an illness of the soul. And in Dr. Pinsker's very moving telling, anti-Semitism is the fear of ghosts. The Jews are a people that are haunting the nations. We are a people that should have disappeared when we lost our land. We are everywhere and nowhere. And therefore, the instinctive human fear for ghosts has been transferred onto the Jewish people, and that is the reason for anti-Semitism. And the solution, the way to heal anti-Semitism, and here again is something that I find so moving about those early Zionists, is that they were looking at anti-Semitism and the cure of anti-Semitism as a responsibility of the Jewish people. We need to help cure the non-Jews of their mental illness by concretizing ourselves, by freeing ourselves from our ghostly condition and becoming a nation like all other nations. Once Jews would have an army, marching bands, postage stamps, the most banal symbols of national sovereignty, those would be the precise means for curing the nations of their anti-Semitism. This, to me, is the most moving Jewish attempt that I know of to come to terms with anti-Semitism. And there is only one problem with Pinsker's analysis, and that is that it's completely wrong. And we now know today that the very concretization of this ghostly people has simply led to a metamorphosis of anti-Semitism, which has barely skipped a beat in its ability to keep up with the transformation of Jewish reality. I'd like to suggest three areas in which to redefine the diaspora-Israel relationship. And the first is political. It is the need to focus the Jewish political agenda in Israel, in the diaspora, on ways of strengthening, ways of fulfilling the Zionist promise to ensure that Israel becomes a nation state respected by other nations. To complete that process, that flawed process, that I would almost say the interrupted process of the normalization, the external normalization of the Jewish people in its relationship with the rest of the world. And to look at what are the external threats and the internal threats to completing the process of our finding our place among the nations. The second is an ideological agenda, and that is redefining the meaning of Zionism to focus on Jewish peoplehood. Zionism as the ideology of Jewish peoplehood. If Zionism is to have any relevance at all in the post-state era, to my mind, it is as the ideology of peoplehood, and I'll explain what I mean by all of these points. And the third and final point is the creation of a shared spiritual agenda between parts of the Israeli public, parts of the North American Jewish public, and that is that we not only have shared responsibility for the future of the Jewish people, but for the future of Judaism, to place the future of Judaism squarely at the center of diaspora-Israel relations, where it has virtually not been at all, except as periodic problems, emergencies related to who is a Jew, women of the wall, and instead to really look at this shared responsibility for Judaism as being at the heart of the future of diaspora-Israel relations. Point number one, a new political agenda that focuses on firming up the Zionist promise of ensuring the place of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, among the nations. The post-Holocaust alliance that emerged between diaspora Jewry and the State of Israel was based on a shared vision of Jewish life. And that vision was that as a response to the Shoah, we would enter non-Jewish public space as a self-defined Jewish collective. That meant rejecting assimilation on the one hand and self-ghettoization on the other. It was a kind of a mediation between those two options. American Jewry and Israel each opted for a different strategy in terms of navigating its entry as Jewish collectives into non-Jewish public space. Israel, of course, as a sovereign state, a nation among nations. American Jewry as a self-defined minority entering into the public space of the world's most important nation. But each of those strategies were really expressions of the same determination, which was to end or negate the message of the Shoah, which was that the Jew is the radical eternal other with no place among non-Jewish society. The post-Holocaust Jewish pushback was we will establish our dignified place within non-Jewish space as Jewish collectives. That, I would argue, was the single greatest achievement of the Jewish people after the Shoah. That achievement is under systematic threat today, both externally and internally. Externally, the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment movement, the attempt to force Israel into a diplomatic ghetto to turn us into a pariah state. And in the United States, the growing assault on the legitimacy of Jewish power, taking the approach of trying to undermine and deny any legitimacy to the Jewish lobby, to AIPAC. Internally, there is also an attempt, in some cases deliberate, in other cases inadvertent, but nevertheless having the same consequence, of leading toward the growing ghettoization of the Jewish people. The rise of the Haredi world, certainly the rise of Haredi power in this country, is a long-term threat to Israel's ability to find its place among the nations. Haredim tend to view the isolation of Israel as confirmation of their theology. It is an expression of the way things are meant to be. The Jew is meant to be the eternal other. And in terms of policy, the expansion of settlements is the single greatest threat to ensuring our growing pariah status. And so what I'm proposing as a new way of measuring, of determining what our political agenda would be is beginning by asking the question, does a particular issue lead to our greater isolation or to our greater integration among the community of nations? And if that becomes our measure, then it's clear that fighting BDS on the one hand and fighting those tendencies internally within the Jewish people, within the state of Israel, that are encouraging deliberately or inadvertently our pariah status are in effect part of the same agenda. Beating back BDS and ensuring that we are not heading toward annexation of the territories are two sides of the same campaign. The second area of redefining or creating a new Diaspora-Israel agenda is redefining Zionism as the ideology of Jewish peoplehood, which I think is really self-evident. When different Jewish ideologies began emerging in the 19th century, the unique claim of Zionism was that Jewish is the ground, is the common ground, and all of these other ideologies, whether religious or political, are expressions of our common identity. The ability of Zionism to succeed, I believe, was in large measure a reflection of its ability to include movements, ideologies that reflected the divisions within the Jewish people. That really was Zionism's greatness. And so if we take peoplehood today as the main contribution that Zionism has to offer ideologically, certainly in our time, then it is a given that Zionism must affirm Jewish life and strengthen Jewish life wherever Jews live, in the state of Israel or outside it. Strengthening diaspora life, which was once, in the period of classical Zionism, seen as an almost anti-Zionist move, is today an expression, a fulfillment of the Zionism of peoplehood. The move is from Shlilat HaGolah, the denial of the legitimacy of exile, to what one could call Chizuk HaTfutzot, strengthening the diaspora. In fact, this is what is happening in terms of policy today. And Sharansky at the Jewish Agency has made this explicit. He is shifting the agency from being the vehicle for aliyah and absorption to being the vehicle of peoplehood. And he was under tremendous criticism from his wife, Avital, who said, you of all people are undermining the Jewish Agency's historic mission of aliyah. And he said, it is now an outmoded view of Zionism and the purpose of the Jewish Agency. What needs to be done, I believe, is to make this move ideologically explicit, where the state of Israel is officially negates the Zionist negation of the diaspora, and we now affirm the need for the vitality of Jewish life wherever Jewish life manages to resurrect, including in places that are admittedly uncomfortable for, I think, for many of my generation. I'm thinking specifically of Poland and Germany, but it means celebrating Jewish life wherever it exists, full stop, as an expression of Zionist commitment to peoplehood. Some points about the question of, the centrality of Israel. There are those who are advocating this new ideology of peoplehood at what I see as the expense of affirming the centrality of Israel in Jewish life. And I believe that is a serious misreading of Jewish reality, certainly for not only for the obvious reasons of the centrality of Israel in Jewish life for thousands of years, but for practical reasons today. First of all, the emergence of Israel as the largest Jewish community, and in all likelihood, the greatest concentration of Jews will be happening here. But I think more profoundly, because no other community of Jews has more at stake in its success or in its failure than Israel. If, God forbid, the state of Israel ceases to exist, then I believe it would be a question mark on the ability of the Jewish people to survive, and that's not true. No other Jewish community has that same weight. One can argue the point, I feel very strongly, that the ability of the Jewish people to have survived previous destructions of sovereignty depended on the quality of Jewish faith. And I don't think we can depend today on the vitality of Jewish faith to carry us past, God forbid, one more destruction. And so, for those reasons and more, I believe that maintaining, affirming the ongoing centrality of the state of Israel in Jewish life is a function of this, of the ideology of peoplehood. Nevertheless, if the diaspora is not the center, it is central to Jewish life. And that is an affirmation that the state of Israel needs to make. There is no Jewish life, there has never been Jewish life without a diaspora, and that certainly is true today. And there is also, I think, something deeply, deeply moving about the fact that we have maintained a model as a globalized people, which much of the world is now seeking ways of emulating for all practical purposes. And so the old phrase referring to the Jewish people as Am Olam, which means the eternal people, also really can and should mean Am Olam in the sense of Jews are a people of the world. We are a people with a center, but we are Am Olam. Question of peoplehood means in affirming this, the ideology of peoplehood. Bless you. What Zionism really is saying is that the state is the shared responsibility of the diaspora and Israel's citizenry. If it is the shared project of Jews around the world, that means that Jews living outside of Israel not only have the right to interfere in our internal issues, not only have the right to criticize, they have the responsibility. And so, peoplehood is all-inclusive. The recent decision of the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations to exclude an organization that is as major as many of the organizations that sit within the conference, an organization that I personally would not join, but that has no relevance at all to this conversation, except I had to say it. The exclusion of J Street from the Conference of Presidents is an anti-Zionist act. It is setting limits on peoplehood, and the logic of peoplehood is that certainly those who want to identify with the Jewish people have to be included, have to have a seat at the table. Now the question though is, what are the limits of criticism? A few years ago, I had a debate with Jeremy Ben-Ami, the head of J Street, about whether Israel should accept the legitimacy of diaspora criticism against its policies during war. And this came shortly after the Israel's war with Hamas in 2009, and J Street condemned the invasion. And my argument was that I'm ready to accept criticism under virtually any circumstances, but emotionally I'm not ready to accept criticism when my son is at war. And his argument was that if we take the responsibilities of shared peoplehood seriously, then if Israelis have the right to criticize, so should diaspora Jews. And as much as emotionally I rebel profoundly against that argument, I have to concede now in a way that I didn't then, that Jeremy was right. If we take the responsibilities of shared peoplehood seriously, then that means opening ourselves up here to a level of criticism that could be intensely uncomfortable. By the same token, the criticism, the critique needs to be reciprocal. Now that should be self-evident, but sometimes I feel that it isn't. And that when we, for example, many of us criticize J Street, the pushback is you Israelis are trying to suppress dissent. And there is a sense that I have that the critics of Israel are seeking a kind of immunity. And they're really, the principle of reciprocity, I think, needs to be very firmly established. What we need from each other, American Jewry, North American Jewry, the diaspora, and Israel, is a way of checking each other's excesses. And by that I mean that because of the circumstances in which each community is living, we have a certain tendency to miss something essential about what Jewish history expects of us at this time. And I believe that Jewish history speaks to our generation with two commanding voices. The first is the commanding voice of Egypt. Remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Do not do unto others what was done to you. Do not be brutal. The second commanding voice is that of Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you when you were leaving Egypt, when you were attacked without provocation. Remember, you live in a world in which genocide is possible. Don't be naive. So don't be brutal on the one hand, don't be naive on the other. It's easy for American Jews in their circumstance to understand the commanding voice of Egypt, not to be brutal. It is easy for Israelis to understand the commanding voice of Amalek, not to be naive. It isn't always easy for each community to understand the fullness, the totality of those two, to my mind, non-negotiable commanding voices. And so each community, if we're working the way we should be, each community should have the ability, and we should have a mechanism in which we could remind the other of the commanding voice, which is easier for us to miss. How can American Jews, diaspora Jews, be more effective in participating in our political debates here? One way is to convey to Israelis an awareness of the complexity of the dilemmas in which we live. When American Jews tend to preach, which is really how I think many of us experience it here, the need to remember that the occupation is a disaster, that peace is better than more territory. The pushback that you get from Israelis is most of us, many of us, I would actually say a majority of Israelis today get that. We understand that peace is better than occupation. But Israelis today really have two nightmares. And by Israelis, I'd say the centrist majority, that is 60, 70% of the public, we have two nightmares. The first is that there won't be a Palestinian state, and the status quo will continue indefinitely. And the second is that there will be a Palestinian state. And most Israelis are in a sense, stalemated against ourselves. The left-right debate, which used to be two strong, almost evenly matched camps, has now been internalized inside many of us. And we argue with ourselves between the left wing and the right wing sides of us. American Jews, to be effective, to be part of our debate, need to enter something of that complexity of our debate. And I just spent 6 months in the American Jewish community, traveling around speaking, and I often felt that I was in a time warp. When I spoke to Orthodox communities, I felt that it was the good old 70s and the 80s, and Begin and Shamir are still in power, and the first intifada never happened, and all we need to do is just keep building and reaffirming our rights. And then when I speak to liberal Jewish communities, it's another form of time warp. It's the 1990s. It's the good old days of Oslo. And all we have to do is have the will to sign the agreement, because the agreement is, we all know what the deal is, and we have a partner for peace, and it's up to us to just make the deal. Most Israelis today don't believe either. And so in order for American Jews, I'd say, to become more effective participants in our political debate would require making a separation between peace and settlements. And by that I mean recognizing that we are nowhere near a peace agreement for all kinds of reasons that isn't our conversation now, but that does not absolve Israel from the responsibility of not complicating the chances for reaching an agreement in the future, and that means most of all freezing settlements. If American Jews were to come to us and say, this is the issue that we are going to make a stand on, rather than telling us that by building in settlements, you are undermining the chances for reaching an agreement now, which I don't know any Israelis who believe that. Nevertheless, there is a very powerful argument to be made about why Israel should not be building in settlements. Make the argument in that way, and then I believe American Jews could be more a part of our conversation. There's a further complexity here in terms of how we deal with criticism. In a sense, dealing with criticism of Israeli policies is the easy part, because we are now encountering a new phenomenon, or I should say an old new phenomenon, which is a resurrection of pre-Holocaust Jewish anti-Zionism, which virtually disappeared over the last decades for all kinds of reasons. The Shoah, of course, the near total destruction of the Bund, which was the great repository of ideological anti-Zionism, the gradual absorption or the acceptance of most of the Haredi world, a tacit acceptance of the reality of the state, the success of Israel. For all these reasons and more, the debate between Jewish anti-Zionism and Zionism that really marked the pre-Holocaust era, especially in Eastern Europe, seemed to have been resolved. We are seeing the beginnings of the reemergence of ideological Jewish anti-Zionism in parts of the diaspora. The question then is, how do we deal with this? And I would look for an unexpected model in terms of how to navigate the far left by looking toward the farthest right of the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world. And I'm speaking specifically of Satmar and Neturei Karta. The difference between Satmar and Neturei Karta both have the same ideological premise. They share more or less the same theological textbooks. Nevertheless, each expresses their anti-Zionism in a very different way. Satmar's anti-Zionism is internal. Neturei Karta aligns itself with Hezbollah. Its leaders attend conferences in Iran. Neturei Karta leaders attended the Holocaust denial conference in Tehran a few years ago. And when they came back to Monsey in New York, they were beaten by Satmar Hasidim, who said, you're making Hasidic anti-Zionism look bad. And I think that that's a very useful distinction to make. We cannot exclude ideological anti-Zionists from our communal debate. We can and must exclude those Jewish anti-Zionists who seek active cause with those forces trying to re-ghettoize the Jewish people, BDS in particular. That, for me, is the Yehareg v'al Ya'avor, really the red line in terms of in determining who is part of our communal discourse and who isn't. The third, and I'll say one last point about Jewish anti-Zionism and in its more virulent form, and that is that I fear that we are approaching a New Testament moment in Jewish history. And by that I mean the moment when a fierce internal Jewish debate in which Jews hurl the worst epithets against each other because we are a dysfunctional family, and that's how dysfunctional families operate. The moment when those mutual accusations cease being the property of a family conversation and become the property or the ideology of outsiders. And I sense the beginning of that shift, and I think that that needs to at least be in our minds when, and especially in the minds of Jewish critics of Israel, not to suppress criticism, because that would have deep and lasting detriment to our ability to function as a healthy people. But I think we need to have some limits, some awareness that we are at a very delicate moment, really at a New Testament moment. The third and final area before opening up for conversation in terms of refiguring the diaspora-Israel relations is the sense of a new shared responsibility for the future of Judaism, for Jewish renewal. If Zionism is the ideology of peoplehood, of Jewish peoplehood, that means, first of all, that there can be no denominational monopoly on Judaism in the state founded by Zionism. To favor one denomination to the exclusion of other denominations is an anti-Zionist act. To hand the keys to the gate of entry into the Jewish people, conversion to Judaism, to a rabbinate that is heavily Haredi, a rabbinate that whose order of priorities in terms of identity is first seeing themselves as a religion, as committed to a religious system, and only afterwards, if at all, committed to the well-being of a people, is a profoundly anti-Zionist act. When I say that there needs to be a partnership between those parts of Israel and the diaspora that are actively seeking the renewal of Judaism, what I mean is that there is now an opportunity, there is now the beginnings of an opening in Israeli society that I don't think we've seen in the past. And that is the beginning of the emergence of indigenous forms of non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel. Not conservative, not reform, although they have had a very positive and strong influence, but indigenous forms that don't even have a name yet. When people ask me what denomination of Judaism I belong to, I tend to say I belong to an Israeli denomination that doesn't exist yet. But I do sense it is beginning to form. And in that sense, we have many allies today in Israel, because I think that there is also the beginning of an emergence of a new cultural center in Israel, which would define the desired relationship of Judaism to state as less official Judaism and more grassroots Judaism. Less Judaism in our laws, and more Judaism in our culture, in our education, and certainly in our family lives. The culture war of previous generations could be defined as, and only half ironically, as a war between the Israelis and the Jews. The Israelis who believed that we were creating a society and a culture that would be a radical break with the Jewish past, and those Jews, Israeli Jews, who saw the state as an organic continuity of Jewish history in all of its periods, biblical and diaspora. I think that looking at Israeli society today, one can say that the Jews won. And Judaism is firmly a part of the Israeli discourse, of the Israeli culture, and nowhere is that more evident than in Israeli popular music. For many decades, classical Hebrew music was the carrier of the secular Zionist ethos. And its message to diaspora Jews was, this is not your music. This is a music that could only be created in this place for this emerging people. Israeli popular music today is the most active carrier in Israeli culture of the re-Judaization of Israeli society. And it is happening through the rediscovery of piyut, the prayer the prayer poems of Sephardic Jewry. It's happening most strongly there in the rediscovery of piyut by a whole generation of leading Israeli rock singers. For those of you who know the names, Barry Sakharov, Eti Ankri, Ehud Banai, Evyatar Banai, Meir Banai, anyone named Banai, and just and these are the leading Israeli musicians, composers, performers today, and they are carrying this new Jewish music. And so the message of much of Israeli music to the diaspora today is, this is your music. This is not music that just belongs to us. We now are beginning to create a shared religious cultural language that is Israeli and diaspora at the same time. The question that is most strongly on the Israeli agenda, I believe, and this will become increasingly evident, I think, in coming years, is not whether Judaism will have a strong part of Israeli cultural and political debate, but what kind of Judaism will prevail in the state of Israel. Will it be a xenophobic, ghettoizing Judaism, the kind of Judaism that was imported from Eastern Europe, from Arab countries, or will this be a Judaism worthy of a sovereign people living as a majority in its land? And here we need help from American Jewry. And in fact, American Jewry is increasingly serving as a model, as a role model for some young Israelis who are looking for ways of creating indigenous forms of Israeli Judaism. And one of the examples is here at Hartman. Our colleague and friend Rani Yegar, who was the founder of Beit Tefillah-Israeli, an Israeli house of prayer, as it calls itself, at the Tel Aviv port. It meets in summer months. Those of you who don't know it, I strongly recommend going. Hundreds of Israelis gathering every Friday night in a uniquely Israeli Kabbalat Shabbat Friday night service. And Beit Tefillah-Israeli was born when Rani visited B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan, BJ, and said, if you could have 1,000 young people in Manhattan on a Friday night celebrating Kabbalat Shabbat, why not in Tel Aviv? So there is the beginnings of an influence. Some Israelis are starting to pay attention to what American Jews are doing religiously. The model that comes to mind for me in terms of a spiritual symbiosis between the diaspora and especially American Jewry, in this case, really American Jewry, and Israel, is depth and width. Israel represents the depth of Jewish history. And the image that I have is of a well that goes deep, and if you're lucky, you hit sweet water, but wells are also narrow and dark. And the model of American Jewry is the model of America itself, expansive, open, seemingly limitless. And each needs a boost of what the other has. Each needs something of expansiveness and something of depth. Now, this model is a gross generalization, as all generalizations are. There is depth and width in both communities. Nevertheless, as a tendency, as a working model, for me at least, that has some value. So where we stand now is that the Blaustein-Ben Gurion arrangement has lapsed, has served whatever usefulness it had. And it is becoming increasingly clear that the great flaw of Blaustein-Ben Gurion was the indifference that was built into the arrangement toward the Jewish life, the new forms of Jewish life that were being created in American Jewry and in the state of Israel. Blaustein Ben-Gurion respected the Americanness of American Jews. It did not respect the American Jewishness of American Jews. And so the next stage of a healthy diaspora-Israeli relationship is to begin seriously looking at the kinds of Jewish life and culture that we've been creating virtually in isolation of each other for the last 7 decades. This crisis that we are experiencing is an opportunity to move past Blaustein Ben-Gurion. It is an opportunity to put vision at the center of the relationship. And I believe that the opportunities that we're facing counterbalance the dangers that the Jewish people are experiencing today. And we have 2 extraordinary centers, Jewish collectives, that have risen simultaneously. I can't think of another time in Jewish history of such abundance, and that we need to realize that in reaching the full potential of both communities will require working together and learning from each other. Thank you. So open for conversation.
Just speak into the microphone.
And if you could tell me who you are before you.
I'm Michael Walzer, and I'm here for the philosophy conference.
Nice to meet you.
You invited us to understand and appreciate the complexities of Israeli politics. I want to suggest to you one of the complexities of diaspora politics. Those of us who are doing what you want us to do, who are fighting against the BDS movement, many of us also believe, as you do, though you didn't quite say it this way, that here the settler movement must be defeated. And then we hear Israeli figures, politicians, public intellectuals, even centrist figures, saying that the main reason to freeze the settlements, to defeat the settler movement, is that if you don't do that, you will become a pariah nation and a boycotted state. And we are fighting the boycott, and you are using the threat
Absolutely
of the boycott to advance what is the right political position here. So if we were to win our fight against the boycott, would that make the occupation and the settler expansion easier?
It's you've raised 2 really important points. The first is the provincialness of Israeli discourse, and the fact that we very often forget that we're not just speaking to each other, but everybody is listening in. And we think because we're speaking in Hebrew that nobody else will understand. And if nothing else, there's always Haaretz in English to offer the translation. And so, yeah, it drives me crazy when I hear Israeli politicians who will remain unnamed saying that we need to stop settlement expansion because this plays into the hands of the BDS movement. And they really don't understand how political activists think, because that is exactly what fuels a political movement. Look, we have them cornered. They're on the run. In terms of your second point, the irony of Israeli politics today is that we have a majority that I think opposes settlement expansion, certainly outside the blocks, but even within the blocks. I think a majority of Israelis, and this came out in a poll just recently for economic reasons, something like 80+% of Israelis wanted to stop building anywhere in the settlements. That includes a lot of Likud voters and Yisrael Beitenu voters. So the problem, though, is that this is a passive majority. Question is, how do you activate that passive majority? And Netanyahu is, I think, really in a bind here, because my strong sense is that he would want to repeat the 9-month settlement freeze that he imposed about 3 or 4 years ago. But the Likud, as it is constituted today, will not let him. The Likud has become a far-right party for all practical purposes, with some moderate-right elements. And Netanyahu no longer has a party that reflects where I think he would want to take the system. And then the question is, how do you activate the Israeli majority that wants to stop the settlements? And I don't have an answer for that.
Eugene Korn, I'm also here for the Philosophy Conference. Yossi, thank you for your rich presentation. You talked in some detail about how Americans might be more effective in talking to Israelis and influencing Israelis, but you did much less with the reverse, how Israelis can talk to Americans and influence America. And if I can talk a little bit, not about the politics of the situation, but about the cultural of the situation, I think most American Jews who are serious about survival were really were given a knockout punch by the Pew study. And one way to read the Pew data is that only the ghettoized Jews in America are going to survive. If you look at the very sobering conclusions, it's only the Haredim in America, in the bowels of Borough Park or in Muncie, that really have high chances of survival. But those of us who are more pluralistic, our survival is threatened. And what I'd like to know from you is, in what way can Israel contribute to the cultural survival of American Jewry that through a pluralistic model and not a ghettoization model? Israel is first and foremost, as you put it, a protest against ghettoization. So to what extent can Israeli leaders, Israeli culture, provide American Jews with a model that have high probability of survival that's not a ghetto model?
So Eugene, let me try to answer your second question first, and that is that you've just offered one more compelling reason for why Israel needs to embrace and make public space for non-Orthodox denominations, because that would be throwing a lifeline to the liberal diaspora. And instead, what we're doing is reinforcing. We are undermining the abilities of these denominations, which really are on the front line of trying to ensure Jewish continuity. That in an open society, we are saying to them, don't look to us for inspiration. Don't look to us for a home, because the message you'll get is that we've already written you off. That's really the message. And what I encounter, especially among young people from Reform and conservative denominations, even more than anger at the occupation, which is very strong in certain circles, is this deep sense of woundedness on this issue. You are telling me that I'm not Jewish. Never mind that I'm second best. I'm actually not Jewish. And the irony of that is that our law of return is so expansive that the message of the state really to diaspora Jews is that we have a broader definition of who we include than you do, than the denominations in that sense. But that's not the message that we're conveying to the denominations. Now, your first question, remind me?
How can Israel influence and strengthen?
How should we speak? How should Israelis speak to American Jews? First of all, the way we should not be speaking to American Jews is in the old, outmoded Zionist language, which Israelis tend to lapse into, and I hear it over and over again. Say, we are the safe refuge for the Jewish people. Who cares about that anymore among younger American Jews? They really do not feel threatened. It's a dead language. It's a dead argument. it resonates for me. It still does resonate for me, but it doesn't resonate for my kids who live here, and it certainly doesn't resonate for their cousins who live there. That's over. And we don't have a new language. And what I've been trying to convey here is something of what a new language might be like. What are the components of a new language? A new language of peoplehood, a new language of shared responsibility for Jewish spiritual renewal, a new political language, not just to defend ourselves against our enemies, but to preserve the extraordinary achievement of the Diaspora-Israel Post-Holocaust Alliance in establishing a place for the Jewish people as a Jewish collective in the non-Jewish world. Those are the kinds of conversations that Israelis are going to need to start learning. And really what it's about, I would put it this way. Zionism, classical Zionism, was the meeting point between need and longing. Need is what defined Israel's relationship with the American Jewish community. You're going to help take care of our need, the Zionism of need. And we have neglected the Zionism of longing. And we need to start speaking again in a language of longing.
Thank you very much. You spoke before about the relationship between Jewish peoplehood and Zionism. And I understand how a Jewish people can have a joint responsibility towards Zionism in Israel. What I don't quite understand, not disagree, simply don't understand, is how how you can have a Zionism of peoplehood. In what sense is the word Zionism correct if you take it beyond national borders?
It's a very good question, Shlomit, and I would say that I go back to the 19th century with the emergence of different Jewish ideologies and movements, and the claim of Zionism was that it represents the whole Jewish people. You could be a Reform Zionist, you could be a Haredi Zionist, as rare as that was. There were some. There was Polei Agudat Yisrael. There were most parts of the Jewish people had some hold, some reflection in the Zionist movement. And what I'm proposing is to pocket the victory of sovereignty, the return to the land, which of course was the pre-state definition of Zionism, and instead go back to that pre-state period and said there was another implicit ideology at work here, which Zionism did not stress because it was busy stressing the immediate goals that it sought to attain. But the fact that Zionism in effect functioned as the ideology of Jewish peoplehood is what we today need to make explicit. And that is an ideology that is certainly not divorced from a center. And again, I think that a Zionist approach to peoplehood is we are a global people with a territorial center. A non-Zionist, a neo-Bundist approach to peoplehood, and one is beginning to hear certain noises in that direction, would be saying that all communities have equal weight, and no one place has any greater claim to Jewish identity than another.
I saw two hands down there in the corner. First Julie, and then the other one.
Okay, my question actually follows directly on what you just said.
Who are you?
I'm Julie Cooper, and I'm here for the philosophy conference. So I was struck by your characterization of this moment as one in which there's a resurgence of ideological anti-Zionism, and that at this moment of the resurgence of ideological anti-Zionism, we're at a New Testament moment in Jewish history, which you seem to characterize as a moment of crisis, a delicate moment, a moment in which, on the one hand, we want to be inclusive and allow voices in the debate. But on the other hand, we do have to draw firm limits such that there's a line that one crosses, namely BDS, at which point you are no longer part of the conversation. And I'm just wondering why you see this moment, which I think you could interpret as a moment in which the ideological options are expanding. Why you see this moment as a moment of crisis rather than a moment of vitality, right? The fact that we actually now are at a moment in which issues that once seemed to be, as you put it, resolved, are now being reopened, with the result that there's an expansion of ideological positions that one can occupy. Why is this a moment of crisis rather than vitality? And I guess part of what's motivating my question is the sense that on the one hand, you're speaking about the renegotiation of the relationship between Israel and diaspora, but it seems like the implicit and perhaps explicit message of the talk is that Zionism exhausts the ideology of Jewish peoplehood.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll respond really as a frustrated Israeli, and the source of my frustration is that the more that Zionism's success becomes apparent in rerouting, R-O-O-T, rerouting, re-indigenizing the Jewish people in this land, the more the legitimacy of our indigenousness is being called into question. And there seems to be a direct proportion between the more time that goes by where we here take our rerootedness for granted, and much of the world is reopening the question of our legitimacy here. And that's a conversation that I personally am not prepared to have. That is a debate that I'm not prepared to have, whether we have a legitimate right to be here. That was a legitimate argument among Jews, among non-Jews, before the establishment of the state. For me, the moment the state was established, the argument has as much validity as arguing whether the Australians have the right, whether Australia has the right to exist, less so because our indigenousness is, I think, more compelling. So I'm responding very testily to the reemergence of Jewish anti-Zionism precisely at the moment when anti-Zionism is becoming more and more legitimized in polite company, but I still am trying to draw a line between what I called Satmar versus Neturei Karta, and one can adapt that to the left. I would equate Jewish Voice for Peace with Neturei Karta, and Jewish Voice for Peace, which is actively involved with helping those within the mainline churches who want to divest from Israel. So that's the line that runs, and I admit that this is at a certain point it becomes a visceral rather than an intellectual issue. But again, intellectually, I'm trying to make some distinction in which anti-Zionist Jews are still part of the communal conversation.
Hi, my name's Erica, and I'm in Israel as a fellow at the Joint Distribution Committee. Much of what you said has really deeply resonated with me, and I have a feeling that a lot of reframing Zionism to be about peoplehood and mending the diaspora-Israel relationship is going to fall on my generation. So I was wondering if you could suggest how you think we go about bringing the vision you mentioned into reality. What are some first steps that we can start taking to work on it?
I have to admit that I'm really bad at that kind of conversation. And I would go to the JDC and ask them that, and or some of the. I mean, we have such a rich communal structure, and we have so many people who really know how to do these things that I will defer to them. But I very much appreciate your comment, and I think you're right. I think the heavy lifting is really going to be done by your generation. And I just hope that my generation doesn't make such a total mess of it that we make it all the more difficult for your generation to figure this out.
Aaron Gross. I'm also here for the Philosophy Conference. Great talk too. Quick questions. I'm not sure that the answers can be quick. One with respect to, in a sense, the call to re-engaging the two centers or the two communities, and you mentioned basically the obligation on the American jury to intervene in the discussion, the debate of things going on in Israel, and the reciprocity that needs to have. And you mentioned stuff about J Street. What is the limit that you see on Israeli conversation in the life of American Jewry? That is the flip side of this. How far can Israel go? Should Israel go? And the second question with respect to the pluralism, and obviously I think this is one of those elephants in the room, the ability of Israel to really be a viable place for Jewry outside and for its own, in a sense, modern Israeli/Jews is by becoming a pluralist, certainly a pluralist religious society. And one of the issues there is that we have a strongly committed group that stands on the one side, and that is met by either groups of Israelis that have checked out, or by groups that are apathetic, or by groups that are what can be called the secular orthodoxy. That is, people who identify themselves as secular but saying, well, the true version of Judaism is the Orthodox. I don't know enough, therefore I defer. And at the same time, American Jewry seems to be maybe afraid to intervene and to put, among other things, its money where its mouth is, and to say, if you don't recognize me as Jewish, I'm not going to send money, or do other things that we can do to try and influence what's going on in Israel. How do you see any of this moving forward?
First of all, I'll address your second question first, because I keep forgetting your first one. And that is that I actually see it moving forward. And let's take Women of the Wall as an example. For 25 years, the Women of the Wall showed up dutifully every month at the wall, were abused, dragged away, chairs were thrown at them, and almost no one in Israeli society paid attention. Certainly not the government, and barely the media. This year, Women of the Wall became an Israeli issue for one reason, because it became an active American Jewish issue. And suddenly the government sets up a commission, and suddenly it's possible to share the space at the wall and to create the first government-sponsored egalitarian synagogue at our most religiously sensitive site. An historic victory that was won by American Jews. So I think that when American Jews throw their weight around a bit, Israelis do tend to pay attention, especially in moments of Israel's vulnerability internationally. And Israelis realize at those moments just how dependent we actually are on the diaspora. In terms of what your first question of what Israel, what are the limits of what Israel needs to say or do in the diaspora, I would put it in perhaps in a negative sense of that. I would hope that when Israeli policymakers determine certain directions for this country, that one of the factors in their consideration is how will this impact on the diaspora, especially some of the more vulnerable diaspora communities. And that, I think, should be a factor at the table in deciding issues like settlement expansion. This could have life and death implications for Jews in certain parts of the world. And my starting point is that how Israeli policies impact on the diaspora needs to be one of the factors. I'm not saying the main, but it certainly needs to be part of the conversation if we expect diaspora Jews to be thinking about how Israel's well-being, how they need to factor in Israel's well-being in their actions and decisions.
Yes, sir. My name is Murray Simon. I'm a guest this evening from the United States. I'm a Chazan. I wonder if you could share your thoughts about the hypothetical situation of someday in Israel the chief rabbi being other than an Orthodox rabbi.
I think if we get to that point, we won't have a chief rabbinate, and that's far more likely. You know, the chief rabbinate is a bizarre institution in Israeli society today. It is an institution without a constituency, and that was not true in the past. At the heyday of the chief rabbinate, you had a very wide constituency. You said the core was the religious Zionist community. You had traditional Mizrahim, Jews from Arab countries. Probably many secular Israelis at least valued the chief rabbinate as a moral institution, as a moral voice. That today, I mean, you can't even mention the words chief rabbinate and morality in the same breath anymore without getting gufas, right? I mean, it's just simply, it's an institution that has lost its legitimacy. Now, what happened to the chief rabbinate as well is that it has become increasingly taken over by the Haredi communities. Interestingly, the Haredim don't look toward the chief rabbis as their rabbis. They still have their own rabbis. They have their own religious authorities. They don't need the chief rabbis. They look at the chief rabbinate as still somehow spiritually inauthentic. It's an institution created by a secular state. The chief rabbis are voted on by, among others, secular politicians. It cannot possibly carry the same weight in their communities as their own religious authorities. And as the chief rabbinate has become more ultra-Orthodox, it has lost its natural constituents. So today you have a rabbinate that simply does not have a constituency. And I wrote a column after the election of these two latest guys, and the title of the column was "I Have No Chief Rabbi," and I thought I was writing something a little bit daring, and the response was simply, "Well, yeah, you know, of course, nobody has a chief rabbi anymore." So really, what we're looking at is an institution that has died, but has not yet been given a burial. And now this institution can continue to do tremendous damage, especially in the realm of conversion. It is the block to admitting thousands and tens of thousands, maybe, of certainly Russian immigrants who want to officially, formally rejoin the Jewish people. It is an historic catastrophe. I don't think we've ever had a situation in Jewish history where we have so many people knocking on our door, which is extraordinary to think that the generation after the Holocaust, one of the main problems facing the Jewish people is, what do we do with all the non-Jews who want to join this people? Who would have believed that 60 years ago? And we have a chief rabbinate that is serving as the gatekeeper and as the bouncer. They are the official bouncer, keeping out those who want to join the Jewish people and help rejuvenate us. So my strong hope is that we won't have a chief rabbinate of any denomination, and that this absurdity of an official Jewish church for an anarchic people and an anarchic religion will simply fade away.
I've seen the room. I haven't seen more questions, and I wonder whether I might take the moderator's prerogative of posing the final question. And it's a question that gives me some considerable discomfort, and I run the risk of phrasing it in a way that will make everybody uncomfortable, but let me try. Your focus is on peoplehood, and as you saw around the room, you know, since it's what Jews have in common, in effect, it's a healing message, it's a benign message, it's a hopeful message, It's what we want to hear. But there's another dimension. To state the problem in the form of a tautology, the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state means that there is a state. It's a state with citizens, and it's a state with national interests. And moving across 7 time zones, we find North America, the United States in particular, which is a sovereign state, and the Jews there are citizens of that sovereign state. That state has interests. The interests of these 2 sovereign states are not entirely congruent. And this, I fear, if mishandled, could create a truly disastrous situation in very short order. And here's what I have in mind. The negotiations with Iran, may have hit a wall, and if they're going to bounce off that wall and go in an even moderately productive direction, I confidently predict that any potential agreement between the United States and Iran is one that the government of Israel will not be able to live with. Okay, but the United States may conclude for reasons of its own that it's in its national interest not to go to war with Iran over its nuclear program. As a matter of fact, I personally believe that the administration has already made that decision but won't admit it. Okay, so there are American Jews. On the one hand, we're deeply worried about the impact of this decision on the state of Israel. On the other hand, many people, including many Jews, also believe that it would be a disaster for the United States to get into a military confrontation with Iran. So how do we think about that, since it's not just people, it's peoplehood that we have in common, but statehood that divides us?
Well, Bill, that's a really important question, and I think it's going to become more and more pressing literally in the next days as the United States seems to be opening up the possibility of some form of military cooperation with Iran against Iraq, which is going to push people here over the edge. If there was any lingering doubt about in Israeli minds about should we really be going against the United States on Iran, I think this will clinch it. So I think you're right, we're heading in very different directions. I'm haunted by something that a rabbi from Los Angeles said to me not long ago, which is that if there is an Israeli strike against Iran, and he said this with deep anxiety, he says he fears that for the first time that Israel will find itself at war, that part of the American Jewish community will turn away and said, you brought this on yourselves, and we are not going to stand with you, even if that means Tel Aviv being under massive missile attack. And so that could be an historic break, a moment of historic break, which may be where we're heading. I think we're heading towards some kind of a crack within the diaspora itself, between that part of the diaspora that will continue to stay connected with Israel and that part that will drift away. So I share that deep fear. One can more crassly call it the Obama divide, in the sense that I think Obama, the way that Israelis have responded to Obama and the way that the majority of American Jews have responded to Obama points to not just political divides, but very deep cultural divisions. The way that we look at the world, the way that we look at our place in the world. And I'm very, very worried. I don't want to end on that note necessarily, but I think that you're right to bring up really a red flag now, and we're at a moment of deep. I feel we already are in the moment of crisis between Israel and the United States, and that crisis could spread to our relations with parts of the American Jewish community.
Please join me in thanking Yossi.